Hey everyone, welcome to In the Mix. I'd like to dedicate a number of videos to the topic of MIDI. This first video will be a basic overview, but many more videos will be added to the MIDI playlist which will cover more advanced and interesting topics. In the early days of electronic music, there was no standard universal list of specifications, so every company had their own proprietary protocol that only worked with their own instruments. You couldn't just get your favorite pedal or hardware sequencer and connect it to any keyboard. The only option was to buy gears from the same company that supported that specific proprietary format. Even then, synchronization between early electronic instruments was problematic. To name a few, they would quickly lose sync over a short period of time, and for more advanced applications, you had to use additional adapters and converters. To solve these issues, an early protocol called USI was developed, and for the first time, a number of instruments could sync and communicate directly. This protocol was eventually improved and adopted under the name of Musical Instrument Digital Interface, otherwise known as MIDI. Once the MIDI standard was accepted, MIDI-compatible instruments from different manufacturers could send and receive musical instructions and talk to one another. MIDI is almost a 40-year-old technology now and hasn't changed much since it was introduced and revised in early 1980s. It's still compatible with older and newer devices. Nonetheless, there's been many exciting developments in how it can be distributed and communicated both in musical and non-musical context. With MIDI, we have so much power and control over a musical performance. For one thing, we can capture all the performance details and record it into a hardware or software sequencers. All physical movements such as playing notes, moving knobs and faders, and pressing switches and pedals can be included in a MIDI recording as well. Then this digital data can be easily edited and manipulated in many different ways and played back. MIDI is just a set of digital commands and instructions that tells a device or multiple devices to function in a certain way. MIDI does not carry or communicate audio. In other words, MIDI on its own doesn't produce any sound, so you would actually need a hardware or software instrument to generate the sound or audio based on the commands that are received through MIDI. This is the reason why the audio and MIDI paths are entirely separate and have their own dedicated inputs and outputs. Even if we use a single USB cable for audio and MIDI transmission, the actual audio and MIDI data are completely different and separate formats. MIDI is not limited to use for digital music. For example, many advanced automated sound and lighting features and on-screen effects in showrooms, concerts, theme parks, video games, projection systems, and multimedia use MIDI on regular basis. Since MIDI is only a communication protocol and not the actual audio, the sonic playback quality of a MIDI track or MIDI file entirely depends on the quality of the synthesizer that's generating the audio. This is a MIDI file on a Windows computer. I'll go ahead and play back the same exact file 3 times back to back, and each time I'll select a different sound source. Right now, it's set up to use the built-in sounds and effects that come with the sound card installed on this computer. Then I'll use an external hardware synth, and finally I'll play the file using virtual instruments. used the same MIDI file, there was a noticeable difference between each playback, and that was due to the different device that was generating the audio. Workstation keyboards normally include an integrated keyboard, built-in monophonic or polyphonic synthesizer with sounds and presets, a sequencer and routing capabilities for audio and MIDI, all in one single hardware unit. There's also portable sound modules and tabletop synthesizers that don't have an integrated keyboard but can be connected to external controllers of your choice through MIDI. Not all MIDI devices look like a keyboard instrument, as they come in all shapes and sizes. There are MIDI devices that are inspired from various acoustic and electronic instruments that may or may not be able to produce audio directly. MIDI controllers are devices that don't contain a built-in synthesizer or tone generators and are strictly used to generate or manipulate MIDI messages. These controllers range from small and portable USB-powered devices to full-sized self-powered controllers. For example, this is a Korg NanoPad 2 MIDI controller and doesn't have a sound engine of its own. It can be programmed to send special MIDI messages to trigger various parameters of a hardware or software instrument. Traditionally, MIDI devices are connected to each other via a 5-pin standard MIDI cable. Both ends of this cable are exactly the same, so it doesn't matter which end is plugged into which instrument. With this cable, MIDI data can only travel in one direction. In order to make a two-way communication network between two instruments, we would need to use a second MIDI cable to communicate data back to the device. Then there are various USB to 5-pin MIDI solutions, which are basically a MIDI interface with built-in cables. For example, the M-Audio USB Uno is equipped with a USB connection to the computer and a 1-in, 1-out MIDI connection to a MIDI device with 5-pin MIDI ports. Many of the newer peripheral devices can communicate to a computer via the USB protocol. Unlike 5-pin MIDI cables and connections, USB MIDI flows in both directions down a single USB cable. Even though USB is a much faster protocol, the transfer rate for MIDI over USB is not any faster. These MIDI devices have a built-in MIDI to USB chip and do not require an external MIDI interface. Akai Advance is a USB MIDI controller and can be connected to a computer directly with a USB cable. Some MIDI devices offer both a USB port and standard MIDI jacks. Sometimes the physical MIDI in, MIDI out ports are disabled when the device is connected via USB, so you might want to consult the user manual to see if both connectors can be used simultaneously. And then there's wireless Bluetooth MIDI controllers and interfaces that communicate wirelessly and do not use the physical ports. Wireless MIDI is relatively a new technology and is not supported by all operating systems and MIDI devices just yet. Akai LPK25 wireless MIDI controller has a built-in wireless transmitter, and it can also connect to any iOS device as well. There are 3 types of MIDI jacks that distribute MIDI information from device to device: MIDI in, MIDI out, and MIDI through. These connectors use 5-pin DIN jacks to connect to MIDI instruments and devices. These ports only control the flow of the MIDI data between devices, so they do not send or receive audio. The MIDI out jack sends MIDI data out to other MIDI devices. Only the MIDI messages that are generated by a particular MIDI device or a software sequencer are sent to the MIDI out port. The MIDI out should always be connected to the MIDI in. The MIDI in jack receives MIDI data from an external source. The data that comes here tells the MIDI device what to do. The MIDI through jack simply echoes the data that comes to the MIDI in of the same device. So all the MIDI data that arrives at the in port is the same exact copy of the data that leaves the through port. This port allows data to pass through a MIDI device to the next instrument in the MIDI chain, so it does not include messages that are sent to the MIDI out port. This port does not include the MIDI messages that are generated by its own module. It only echoes the MIDI in messages coming from external sources. So if I play this keyboard, nothing's going to come out of the through port. All MIDI messages will only be sent to the MIDI out port. Some MIDI devices don't have a dedicated MIDI through jack, but might give the option of switching the MIDI out to MIDI through. Let's check out 3 of the MIDI devices that I have here. I'll go ahead and call them Synth A, Synth B, and Synth C. Synth A is the main controller, which has 4 5-pin MIDI jacks, 1 MIDI in, 1 MIDI through, and 2 MIDI outs that are identical but can be used to connect to 2 different MIDI devices simultaneously. If I play this keyboard, all MIDI messages will only be sent to the MIDI out port. In this setup, playing Synth A will not send any MIDI messages to Synth B because the MIDI through does not communicate messages that are played on its own module. The MIDI out should be connected to the MIDI in port instead. Now, the MIDI in port on Synth B receives incoming MIDI messages that are generated by Synth A. This means Synth A is the master and controls the actions of Synth B. Obviously, if we wanted to have a two-way communication, then we can connect the MIDI out on Synth B to the MIDI in on Synth A by adding a second cable. This time, I'll go ahead and use Synth A as the master keyboard to trigger the sounds of Synth B and C. Let's review the MIDI signal flow again. Whatever I play on Synth A is going to come out of the MIDI out port, so the MIDI out port should be connected to the MIDI in port of Synth B. Because I'm not playing Synth B directly, nothing will come out of its MIDI out, so in this case, Synth C will not receive any MIDI messages from Synth B. All MIDI data that arrives at the MIDI in port of Synth B only goes out to the MIDI through port and not the MIDI out, so I need to use a MIDI through to MIDI in connection between Synth B and C instead. Finally, all MIDI data generated by Synth A will pass through Synth B and arrive at the MIDI in port of Synth C. With this setup, even if I play Synth B, nothing will be added to the MIDI data that is being transmitted from Synth A to Synth C. This method of connecting or chaining multiple MIDI devices is known as daisy chaining, which allows us to echo and send MIDI messages from the main controller to the other devices in the chain. In this method, up to 16 channels of MIDI data can be transferred from one device to the next. The main MIDI controller that sends the data to other devices is referred to as master. The rest of the devices that act as receivers are called slaves. The master device can be a keyboard or even a sound module amongst other types of controllers. To use a computer and software sequencer as a master MIDI device, we can either use a USB cable or a MIDI interface with 5-pin DIN jacks. Most computer MIDI devices don't have MIDI through because within the software sequencer you can turn the MIDI out into MIDI through. Let me give you an example of a computer keyboard configuration. Synth A, which is the main controller, is connected to the computer. Anything I play on Synth A flows to the MIDI in jack of the computer's MIDI interface. Then the MIDI data is processed and routed back to the MIDI in port of the master controller, which is Synth A. From this point on, depending on the setup, we can just follow the signal flow and make the physical connections to the rest of the instruments. Of course, if we already have the MIDI file stored in the computer, we won't need to use Synth A as master controller or input device anymore. In other words, we can just connect the MIDI out of the computer to the MIDI in of Synth A, which is considered a slave in this case. There is a minor processing delay when the MIDI messages travel from device to device. If we daisy chain too many devices, the cumulative side effect will be an extended and audible delay. If you need to exceed a 3-device chain, it would be best to use either a multi-port MIDI interface or a dedicated MIDI Patchbay. They offer multiple MIDI ins and outs, and you'll be able to connect the slave devices to the master controller directly. Typically, with a MIDI Patchbay, you can easily control the signal path and change the routing for the MIDI devices internally without having to reconnect cables. Also, a decent MIDI Patchbay may offer many useful synchronization features for scoring music to video and more. Sync features allow external devices such as DAWs and video playback systems to be simultaneously played back using the same timing reference. This is the Motu MIDI Express XT Patchbay and provides plug-and-play connectivity to any USB-equipped Mac or Windows computer. I'll dedicate the next MIDI video to this particular Patchbay. I hope you found this video useful. If you'd like for us to cover a specific MIDI-related topic, or if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to share your thoughts down below in the comments section. See you next time!